everyone, and thank you for joining us on your Friday, wherever you are. I'm Vanessa Raymond. I'm the data governance lead at Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and I see many friends and former colleagues on the call today, so hello to all of you. I'm currently on, Ryan, currently on the Trothuda campus of University of Alaska Fairbanks on Trothuda itself. Very exciting to be physically located on Trothuda. And I'm really excited to share this hour together with you, and very grateful to our panelists and the IARPC data management co-leads for pulling together this time together. So first of all, IARPC is the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, and it combines 18 federal agencies, departments, and offices, as well as non-federal people. Just for your frame of reference, more about that is in the agenda and the meeting notes. And then the data management collaboration team has two core objectives in this phase of our lives. One is to encourage findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, so FAIR. And then CARE, which is collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics with regards to data management principles in the Arctic. And we do that by creating a space and a community to talk about data in interactive ways. And hopefully you will see that in our time together today. I would love to pass the mic to our panelists to introduce themselves briefly before we jump into defining data management from each of these experts. So I'm going to start with have Jeff Ward start, then Jeff Doctor, and Adrienne.
Anim Bourgeot, Jeff Ward, Dijnakas, Animikii, Kiwisan, Sindigo, Trudiwan, and Donjaba, and I'm connecting in from the Kwangin speaking territory, colonially known as Victoria. I am Ojibwe and Métis on my dad's side, and English and Ukrainian on my mom's side, a member of Sandy Bay First Nation. Miigwech, thanks for having me. All day. Okay. Just give it up. Can't hear you.
Okay, Eric, can you hear me now? Is it now working? Okay, I'm gonna try some shenanigans here. Apologies. All right, that should work. So I'll try again. So Scano, Jeff Doctor, Gaigohono from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. I'm an impact strategist here at Animikii, and we're an Indigenous tech company, and a lot of the work that I do revolves around the ethics of technology as we create custom software. My big focus is on Indigenous data sovereignty, because being Haudenosaunee, or one of the members of the Six Nations of the Grand River, Cayuga specifically, we're from, I guess, from the perspective of this conversation, really from the south. Like, our territory is like southwest of Toronto, so that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from in this conversation. So yeah, I'll end it there. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Adrienne Canino. I use she, her pronouns. I am also in Anchorage, the traditional lands of the Dena'ina people, the home of them today. And I work at Axiom Data Science as a data librarian. That means that I love metadata and organizing things and doing data curation. And I work with our data management team.
Lovely. Thank you all for your intros. So we're going to jump right into having each of you define data management. And I would love to hear from each of you. Let's just keep the same order, but then maybe we can morph into more of a discussion-based process as you hear from each other and reflect on your own experience managing data. So can we start with Jeff, then go to Jeff and Adrienne?
Sure. So yeah, as a software developer, I've been building data tools for the past, well, just say 20 plus years. And through that, building custom software, in supporting Indigenous focused initiatives through tech. looking at data management, like we didn't always have the word Indigenous data sovereignty, but that's essentially what we have been doing for all of these years, in looking at how data is managed. And now we have other frameworks like OCAP and fair and care principles and things like this. But just from a practical perspective, working with Indigenous data around management, I believe that's the ability to design data, including like the containers of data that we put into, because a lot of times when people will show up to us as software developers, it's because, you know, maybe data is needed to conform to, say, colonial systems or other systems that are designed by others. And so I think the design of data is super important to have sovereignty over that. But then once that data is there, you have all those containers for managing the relationality of data, the ability just to work with that on the day-to-day, add new data, manage, you know, all this sort of create, read, update, and delete data is in say web-based software, for example, like which has been my focus. Then the ability to govern access to that data. And so who has access, this sort of thing. And the final thing around when I think about data management as a whole is just where that, be able to manage where that data physically lives. So where is it hosted? Where is it, where is that managed? And so all of those things together, when I think of data management. Pass it over to Jeff.
Yeah, so this reminds me of a conversation I was having with our team internally just the other day about, like, what does Indigenous data sovereignty mean? And I feel like every time I get into the weeds of what that means, it's like that meme of the chalkboard and all the different, or not the, like, you know, the sticky board with like all the lines going everywhere. And then I go on this long, wacky rambling, because it's just such a big over-encompassing concept of not only sovereignty, but then adding the Indigenous aspect into that adds a whole lot. And then obviously what is data? So breaking it down even further, I find it really helpful about a lot of the work that academics have been doing in the Indigenous data sovereignty kind of movement to, and this points back to like the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, the folks that are responsible for creating the CARE principles. And they've more recently articulated that like there's also a rights-based or a rights component of data. So when we're talking about like Indigenous data sovereignty as this big kind of umbrella term, really what that means in a more practical sense is both data for governance and the governance of data. So if we're going to break that down even further, if we're thinking about like governance at like the policy layer, at like the legal layer, at the who does what and how, well, breaking that down further into like the actual day-to-day management of those data, the stuff that we all are involved in all day, every day. We manage our own personal data, but as Indigenous data, you throw that Indigenous moniker or whatever the concept in front of it, and then now it becomes collective. So now it's not just a matter of managing a whole bunch of little pieces of individualized data. Now you're dealing with collective data. And arguably all data is collective because it exists always in relationality, but when dealing specifically with Indigenous data, then, and again, like there's no such things like a singular Indigenous data, it's always plural. And so it might be more even apt to talk about like governing Indigenous data is like, I always use data as a plural, and especially dealing with Indigenous data management, because again, you'd want to de-emphasize the individual nature of these data, re-emphasize the collective nature of it, but then that ties back into that higher level of governance, because the moment you're starting to deal with collectivities, you have to figure out who is going to agree on things and how are they going to do it together, and then how does that filter down into like the day-to-day action. So I'll leave it at that.
It's hard to follow those, but I'm Adrienne. As a data librarian, I come from the Western Science School, and I'm on the learning curve right now about learning how to incorporate the CARE principles and in the bigger picture, Indigenous data as a concept, as the moniker that Jeff was just talking about, reframing and resituating the way I look at all of this. So I'm on that learning curve right now as well. On the Western science side of data management, where they love neat and clean definitions, there's a lot of over-under topics that are under hype topics that I could get to, but I'll save it. And I'll say that the Western science perspective of data management would talk about the data lifecycle, and it would talk about how that lifecycle is a circle that feeds into itself. And we want to talk about how, like, it's about making that data have a longer life cycle and be reusable again to someone else in the future so that it can go forth and have as much value as possible. And I think that that's sort of where my practice is sitting right now, where I think about the active life cycle of data. And to that end, if I may, I sort of have a question back to Jeff Doctor. If you could give an example of how those bigger picture idea of the data as collective are filtering down into day-to-day decisions, sort of like step-by-step pieces of the process. Do you have an example that you could share about how that works?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, like, often we're talking about like an indigenous language, for example. That's kind of a classic go-to case study of indigenous data, because it's relatively clear-cut that here you have something that is used by specific peoples, created by those specific peoples for them. And it's not like a singular individual ever owns a language. A language only exists in relationality with other people as it's used, as it's applied. And so from a Western standpoint, you might think, oh, well, then those peoples will, quote, own that language. Really around data denotes that it's something that can necessarily be possessed like this dead inert item. However, even the way that you've just described data, like a data life cycle, I think it's more apt to think about data as something that is more akin to being alive, in the sense that is always in relationality to lots of different people at once in like a network type effect. So meaning that because it is something that is closer to being alive instead of this kind of dead inert object, that means there's responsibilities inherent into dealing with those data. And so what do those responsibilities look like? So that's a different kind of relationship of kind of this notion of like this paternalistic ownership over data. Like it's something that you can just grab, hold, put in a little box, like this is mine now. Well, it's like, well, if it has something closer to aliveness, or something closer to like having its own kind of agency of a sort, that denotes a different kind of relationship that not only is involving you dealing with it, but also other people that also have a relationship to those data as well. And so thinking about all that at the same time is a lot harder because that's not often how folks are trained, and especially in Western sciences, that conceptualize data as this dead inert thing that can be collected and owned and all these kinds of things, right? And even in the OCAP principles by the First Nations Information Governance Center. I'm not trying to slam on them or anything, but this notion of ownership and possession, that's not a universal translation into a lot of Indigenous worldviews of the potential relationship of data, of people and their data. But I don't want to go into too many rabbit holes. I don't know. Hopefully that answers some of the questions.
Yeah, it was. Thank you.
Yeah, there's so many rabbit holes that abound, but I love this topic of responsibility and relationality, and those are beautiful things to think about. And I think they span both Indigenous and Western concepts about data management. Jeff or Adrienne, did you have more to add to this definition of data management? Something you forgot?
Sure. Yeah, it's to build on also what Jeff was saying, and the question is, thinking about what are the data that people are generally interested in to collect on, with, for Indigenous peoples. I think it's something that all of us here and that are interested in this conversation today sort of grapple with on the day-to-day and through each of our work. Especially in context of this group, it's these things that carry these collective rights and things that really no one person can, have authority over. We're talking about land, water, air, energy, people, culture. Like it's this collectiveness that can be tricky to navigate around the governance about these collective rights and sort of who gives consent for that data. How can that that data governance or maybe data trust be managed? But yeah, I think it's why we're all here today, is to have these conversations and navigate this together.
I don't have anything to add, but if anyone in the room is suddenly like, wait, what is the like definition? I realize that I'm not giving the Western science actual definition. If you super need that, please put it in the chat and I'll point you to resources that do a better job defining it if you are interested.
And that's a great segue, Adrienne, to our next activity, where we really wanted to crowdsource from everyone here, so not just ourselves, any relevant or pertinent, oft-referenced data management tools that you use. We were hoping this would be an offering back to everyone who came so that you can walk away with a list of resources you may not have encountered before, and also to share the ones that you love and cherish. We all have those like, oh, you got to look at this link, and then no one looks at the link. Well, this is a moment where you are in a room with people who might look at the link. So I'm going to put the link in the chat. We do have one person joining from the phone. And so I'm not sure how we can best support you to engage in this activity. I will be sharing my screen so you will see what people are writing. And if you wanted to come off mute and share a reference, I can type it in for you. You just came off mute, so feel free to let us know how we can support you.
Hi, I'm Leandra with the North Borough Department of Wildlife Management. I guess I'm the only one calling. I don't know if you guys know, but the Arctic and Northwest Arctic no longer have a connectivity because of a optic fiber cable that broke off on Sunday. So on these next meetings, most of us up here in the Arctic won't be able to connect via Zoom. But I am listening, and thank you for hosting the meeting. Thank you.
I appreciate you so much for dialing in and joining us. If there are any references, your organization puts out a lot of great ones related to Arctic data management that you want us to put into the shared document. Please do let me know. And again, thank you. We are all thinking about everyone who has lost access to the internet.
Yeah, it's probably worth mentioning here, like going back to like the sovereignty aspect of Indigenous data sovereignty. What does that ultimately mean? Well, when it drills down into like the management layer of data, like as peoples, but also their own distinctiveness. And so, while we use terms like Indigenous as like this large catch-all, dealing specifically with Indigenous data means who are you actually dealing with that has relations to those data and where. So depending on the territories in which you're operating, you're going to be dealing with different layers of sovereignty, potentially plural. There could be competing or not competing, but necessarily overlapping kind of aspects of sovereignty to those particular locations where you're dealing with multiple peoples and dealing with their different ways of doing things, meaning that when it comes to standards, when it comes to policy, when it comes to even laws surrounding how do you actually go about your day-to-day of how to follow like federal law, or in the Canadian context, also provincial law. And while you have to necessarily do that so you don't get like sued or thrown in jail, if you're truly respecting, Indigenous data sovereignty, that adds an extra layer of complexity because now you're also considering Indigenous laws. So the laws of those particular peoples, and how do they govern their data? How do they manage their data? How do they do things from their worldviews, their perspectives, but also their day-to-day management practices? So the way that you manage data might be legally fine in terms of privacy law or whatever, but then when you're dealing with a specific people, they may be very deeply uncomfortable, if not downright offended, or from their perspective, what you're doing is illegal and thus can be sanctioned. And those sanctions might be something like, not inviting you to their territories again, or something more harsh. So that also applies to data as well. And scientists are not immune to this.
thank you for that addition, Jeff Doctor. There are so many people on this call and all across sort of the Arctic research landscape that are really trying to understand how do we implement best practices. And unfortunately, for many people, it is not a simple cut and dry checklist sort of situation. It's about building relationships, and human relationships, cultural relationships, respect-based relationships are messy and they take time. And I think you put that very succinctly. I'm curious if Jeff or Adrienne have reflections on what Jeff has just shared, or any of the management resources that are coming onto the screen now.
I'll jump in here just to say, and I try to say this as many venues as I can, the time to build the relationships must be valued time and must be accounted for in all the other ways that like working tasks need to get accounted for. If this is your day-to-day job, or if this is your role in a community, say you're part of a community of practice around a data or a place, the time to take out and think about making the relationship happen and all of the work that goes into a healthy relationship must be accounted for. And at least in the Western science side of things, we're really bad at that part and we need to be better. So I like to say that in every venue I can.
I do want to quickly mention also that, like, again, these things sound great until it actually, like, it comes to the day-to-day work, the labor, the way that things are actually done. And often when you're dealing with marginalized populations, they don't necessarily have the quote capacity, really meaning that they've been oppressed. And so it's a bit of a luxury to have policy, to have regulations, to have all these kinds of things that the West can take for granted, because, you know, there's a reason why they have those things. But meaning that, you know, if you just fly into a community and you expect this community to just give you this like articulated data management plan, this is what you need to do, and for them to just tell you, or worse, you just go and ask them without really understanding the context, you might be putting additional labor, additional burden on that particular community. And so sometimes it can help to at least be informed about all of these different practices in a whole bunch of different territories, while still understanding that those particular practices in someone else's territory may not really truly apply in the situation that you're finding yourself in, but at least you're having a starting point. And maybe that's something you can bring in to be like, hey, this is how other people have managed data in the past that I've worked with. You can detail these things out. How do you feel about that? And that could be one way of kind of starting those relationships in a way that's less burdensome.
It's something I've been thinking about a lot in data work is invisible work. I think for software developers, data managers, data librarians, anyone doing any data cleaning, and then also Indigenous people who are either kind of having this thrust upon them or are doing their own research and science and data management. A lot of that goes unseen, and as you're both talking about, unaccounted for, unplanned around. And as we all collectively in this work called data reflect on how we can improve, I think exposing the invisible work and accounting for it in better and more just ways is going to be a part of that reckoning.
Yeah, and I guess I should clarify that, like, people's always have ways that they govern and manage their data. But like you're saying, that can be invisible, particularly to an outsider. And so you have to kind of like, I don't want to say that, like, you know, communities don't have their ways of doing things. Obviously they do. That's why communities are communities. But there is a sort of sometimes a translation aspect of it that needs to ultimately happen. But then, like you're saying, Vanessa, like, that's a labor component. And when there's labor, then you're also talking about power. You're talking about potential inequities in that relationship that you're bringing into things. So how are you resourcing these things properly? How are you paying people for their time? Doesn't necessarily have to be in terms of monetary compensation, but where, again, is that relationship happening in terms of, equitable labor?
Yeah, I think, sovereignty means sovereignty, and deferring to those that we're serving through data management, or if we're brought in to help or to help create solutions, which I think most people on the call are in a role similar to that. And we've tried to manage this our approach to building data solutions through a process we've developed that we call pathfinding, where we center Indigenous laws and values and those of the partners that bring us in. Yeah, there is so just trying to defer to the people that the communities we're here to serve, they are the experts in their data, in their contexts, in their communities. We've in Indigenous communities, we always get people coming in trying to solve things for people and bring in their solutions, or the consultants, or the people, just trying to come in. So it's how do we yes, bring our expertise and skills to help manage some of these things, but deferring to the communities and the leadership there. And I think that I just want to echo this notion of building relationships through that work, and yes, making time for that to happen. Not just jumping right into business or the tech at hand. And that stuff takes time. That stuff is not always valued in sort of capitalistic colonial approach to how we work. And so making time for that, the relationship building and understanding is part of the work.
Well, thank you, all three of you, really, for your reflections here. They're really powerful. And so we're having a lot of resources come in, and they're running the gamut from local to Alaska, sort of national and international resources. I'm wondering if the three of you could take a scan of these and see if there are any that jump out to you, or any that you would like us to add to this list for people who are going to take this away and help it inform their data management practices.
One nod I do want to give is Maori are really taking a lot of leadership in both at the high level of data sovereignty from a principled standpoint, but also in terms of the relationship with the state, relationship with researchers, relationship with people. And there's a lot that I think folks can learn from. But again, they are very adamant about their knowledge, their ways of doing things is Maori specific. And so there's going to be certain things that don't translate. And I really appreciate that they're using their own language, that they're using their own terms, their own philosophies as much as they can in this work, because there's always going to be things that do not translate, particularly translating from Maori to to English and then back into the community that you're working with. So being able to also utilize local languages in the work that you're doing is also super important. But again, that's an extra labor component.
And I see databack.animikii.com. So would anyone care to talk a little bit about that?
You want to go for a boss man?
Jeff Jeff is being shy. Jeff is the lead writer of the data-backed ebook, so I think.
So basically, what we're finding is that there's so much. Yeah, me and Trevor, Jen Polek, she pretty much me and her back in the day, we wrote a whole bunch of blog articles when I started with Animikii, actually, when Jeff first hired me as a consultant, was basically how do we start translating these large, really academic concepts at the time into much more understandable language for like community members. And just like, again, at the management, the day-to-day kind of mundane aspect needs to be at least some level of understanding about like the bigger issues, but then how do we also tie that into stuff that people can relate to? And so what we're calling our data-back ebook is an attempt to take what I started this conversation with, like every time I talk about data sovereignty, it is that, you know, crazy corkboard, into a much more, not quite linear, but something that is a little bit easier to understand, to break some of these high principles down into language that I'm hoping is more accessible for people beyond just like the big chunks of like academic text that some of us are very much used to. But if you're outside of those environments, like your eyes will just glaze over and folks won't read it. So it's not to say that like folks like the academics and the indigenous data sovereignty movement aren't doing good work, because they are. That's often where I pull a lot of my talking points, and a lot of the knowledges that I'm learning from this space is the academics doing the work. But there needs to be a translation layer back down into, you know, just common day-to-day language that people can feel much more associated with. And I mean, the same thing goes for any academic, really.
Thanks for letting me put you guys on the spot there. There's a lot of great resources here. I often talk about UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and want to credit some of the people who are here on this call, Inuit Circumpolar Council, for contributing very heavily in those negotiations over about a decade or so. And the strong representation of Inuit and Alaskan Inuit as well in those conversations. We have World Intellectual Property Organization, and I think that's a interesting space, right? When we talk about property, intellectual property, we're often really misaligned with Indigenous concepts and laws. And so I think there's a lot of dynamic conversations that need to happen there. Arctic Data Center and ILOCA, really grateful to have those people when we talk about academics doing translational work. I think there's a lot of great work coming from both of those organizations. And full disclosure, I did work at the Arctic Data Center, but I don't anymore. And thank you to whoever put the IARPC principles for conducting research in the Arctic. I should have, but I did not as a plant. Well, we have another discussion to move on to. Are there any final thoughts from our panelists on data management resources that you look at and want to discuss?
I have so many, but I just don't have the mental capacity to just throw them in here right now. But what we tried to do also with the ebook is it's hyperlinks. We haven't, like, I do at some point, like, and find the time to do it. Do want to create a much more comprehensive database of all the resources that are floating around in my head and put it in one spot. So we're hoping to put that on our databack website, which we can link in the chat. Which will host both the ebook itself, which you can download, but we're also hoping that at some point, again, when I can find the time to do the work, to create a much stronger resource list. Because even when we wrote that book, we were doing it from our cultural perspectives. So it is very Haudenosaunee and very First Nations oriented. And so that is a weakness of it. And it has to be, because I can only speak from my perspectives. And even then, I can only speak in ways that, you know, I'm held accountable to my own community. So in some ways, I'm not really writing that for other people, as I'm writing that so my own community can look at it. Because if I get something wrong, you know, I'm going to hear about it. So, but that's the way that things should be. That is how I think that both Indigenous researchers and non-Indigenous researchers need to be held accountable by someone. Again, it goes back to the collective nature of data. If you're not held accountable by the way that you relate to these data by people, like actual living, breathing people, then I don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, it becomes very real when your own community sees what you're doing. Whew, yeah. Well, we have, I think, 4 or 5 very relevant and pertinent comments and questions in the chat. And I wanted to let everyone know that we have the last part of this meeting to go through those. If you have other questions that you're thinking about at this point, please drop them in the chat and we will attempt to address them. But right now we wanted to have a topic discussion called over under. So we were trying to decide whether it's overhyped or over appreciated, but regardless, over under. And we came up with a list of things to fuel this conversation. So I'll just throw out a term and then have the panelists respond. The first one might be on everyone's mind. It's Excel, or data in spreadsheets if we want to get away from just Excel.
Actually, I would like to hear from the Jeff and Jeff team here about this, because I was just in a meeting this morning with other software developers. I'm keeping my information that I need to translate to them to build a thing in a spreadsheet. And they're sort of like, oh, how can I get this in JSON? So I just, I was wondering if I see nods. So Excel as a software spreadsheet so often gets used as a visualization tool. And I caught myself doing it myself this morning, where I'm expecting it to behave like a table for everyone, but then you try to feed it to a machine and the machine is like, I don't understand a visualization. I want a line with comma separated values that I understand. So more.
Spreadsheets, data and spreadsheets. This is I think one of the go-to solutions for people wanting to respect Indigenous data sovereignty, because you can put it on a device and it's not cloud-based, it's right there. I think it's a good starting point for data. However, when you grow beyond the need of kind of, well, like what you were just saying, like there needs to be either you need the skills to work within the limitations of that, or you need to take it to the next level. So like we're building a tool called Niwen, and this is like, okay, you've pushed the limits of spreadsheet stuff. Now you need something a little bit more robust, but in particular, when data needs to be collaborated on, that I think is the important piece there, because we've all seen the Excel file that's been emailed around that's like version 2, June 16th, final in parentheses, JW's comments, final, we run into that when data needs to be collaborated on. So I think it's a good starter tool for like, maybe field work, but so I'm not sure that's under or overhyped, but maybe I'll say underhyped. I think it's a great tool and a good starting point.
Yeah, I think like it's underhyped in the sense of just how prevalent, so I'm also kind of used to be like a scholar of like science and technology studies. And so understanding how all technologies are political, they come from somewhere and they all have their own legacy. So even the notion of a spreadsheet is a particular kind of technology that has its own roots I'm not going to get into here. And we've just since kind of jury-rigged them for so many extra purposes beyond really probably what they should be used for. And that causes problems. It just does. And so I don't want to like hype our own kind of work too much, but like some of the work that we're doing is a response while still understanding and appreciating from like a user understanding component. Like folks are often know how to use spreadsheets because it's been so normalized. And so when it comes to like a user interface of like tables and rows, lots of folks are familiar with that concept. And so if we're going to design a product that still respects folks that as users are used to using that, well, maybe that's in a way how we both design our front end, like the way that our app, behaves. At the same time, there's certain limitations to that logic of rows and columns as well that we have to also consider. So it gets into both a really kind of messy design aspect in terms of how do we build something that might behave similar to a spreadsheet so that the users are familiar with it, yet like isn't, because that's why we're building something different. But yeah, I could talk about spreadsheets.
It sounds like the consensus is underhyped, actually, which I love because I personally, a good spreadsheet, it's a beautiful thing. I mean, it's literally just beautiful. But Jeff, you kind of referenced one of the other over-under topics to be discussed by you all, which is file names.
I don't know, overhyped. I don't know. I don't think it's a good tool for collaboration if the file name is your solution. I don't know.
At the same time, also kind of underhyped in the sense that like, it's so important the way you name things, especially if you're dealing with like a static entity, like a spreadsheet, that what is the quote, like source of truth? And the moment that you're creating copies of something, it's one of the key challenges that we're dealing with digital data is so easy to copy. But then like Jeff said, then you get copy version 8, like whatever. And if there's not name standardizations, then what? And this kind of like, I can feel like the archivists or like the librarian type folks in this room, like wanting, but again, that comes into like a usability gonna be and how you create standards for those names. Yeah, that's a whole thing. So I think it's super important, file names. It's something that I don't think is very appreciated, both in your personal life, but also definitely in a collaborative research, definitely in a research life, but I'm not gonna get into that.
Yeah, +1 to the like, in terms of collaboration, putting your initials at the end of the file. We've so all seen that. And then also like to speak to the, it is underhyped because the naming of things in a digital environment. I've seen a data archaeology project recently that we were doing that the parent folder was the only way to know the difference between two files named exactly the same. So if you're trying to, as like a librarian, get through there and understand how to put those two files on the shelf, so to speak, just tearing my hair out. Oh, so file naming, underhyped in some ways.
And also I do want to mention, I know with my computer, if I have certain characters in that file name and I try to say compress the file or do it in other kinds of software, it's like, no, can't do it. So if you're dealing with indigenous data, that can only be done in indigenous language, and then you have to create that file name in indigenous language, and that file system cannot recognize that. That itself is an institutional barrier.
And you were lagging on my end, Jeff, but what I heard was that if you have an indigenous file name and you try to manipulate it in some way, it might actually cause problems because you're using a non-English language. Is that what other people heard from him? Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure it was clear for everyone. So we have maybe one more topic here. So I will throw it out to the collected people here to vote in the chat. We could talk about data theft, which is a hot button term in of itself, but in parentheses, the data used to train AI and models. We could talk about consent, or we could talk about the cloud. In our last version of this, over under hyped. So throw a quick vote in the chat if you have access to it, and then we will do one more round of this before opening it up to your questions that you've already been putting into the chat. Ooh. Oh man, it's split between AI and the cloud. You need a tiebreaker. Okay, so the topic is the cloud.
I can go first and just start with overhyped, I think, the cloud, because the cloud exists somewhere. We don't just, it doesn't, it's not, the name implies it's ephemeral and magic, and it's not. The cloud is a data center somewhere that probably uses a ton of water. It's a whole other rabbit hole. And And I think the folks thinking, it's become a shortcut thinking, like, oh, the cloud somehow has shortcut us in thinking to, that means the data will just always be available, or always be well organized, or always be able to run through this analytical tool that I want to run every hour on the top of the hour. And it's not. That's a shortcut. You're cutting off all of the work that the pipelines need to be built, and all of the like original on the ground ideas of the data and the purpose of the data. And also still need a human there to make sure the data is going to achieve whatever goal you have set out for it. The cloud doesn't take the place of that, in my opinion. I see that a lot, and I think overhyped because of that.
Yeah, overhyped. The word cloud was definitely a marketing term invented. Yeah, cloud is just a server running hardware somewhere else, and on indigenous land somewhere else, by the way. And so, but I think what the cloud discussion, I think what that sort of solved, or was aiming to solve in the developer community, was more of like a scalable server architecture and storage, because around at that time, like all of these services like Amazon Web Services and other cloud providers, it did solve a lot of just managing that, but the tools are better now for managing this. And what I'm seeing in the developer community is a shift away from all of that, where people are just using tools to manage their own server architecture and scalability. And we're even seeing this in indigenous context now, and where a lot more indigenous communities are, taking data back and hosting it in their communities. So overhyped.
Yeah, hopefully I'm not being too robotic now because my data in the cloud is not cooperating. But one thing that's worth mentioning is just the nature of colonialism is always inherent in arguably like any kind of mainstream tech. And cloud computing, in my personal, not so humble opinion, is another forerunner, or at least another avenue for a lot of land dispossession. There's a direct correlation between like giant real estate investment firms and data centers. So most of the data that you have residing on some location is ultimately on stolen indigenous lands, but then rented out to these other larger data centers. And then there's all these kinds of chains of rentership that somebody's got to pay for at the end of the day. But also because of the inherent nature of the endless growth potential of something like data, it makes capitalists very excited, because now from their perspectives, they can basically endlessly grow. And so that ultimately, like Adrienne is saying, has a material consequence. And so as the growth of big data, like data is growing exponentially in terms of raw volume all the time. And we're all part of this. Every time we do a YouTube video, every time we do, like you're saying, a calculation, anytime you're using quote raw computing power, particularly if it's in the cloud, you can't witness it. You can't see it. You can't feel the heat emanating from your machine. You can't hear the fan, buzzing right beside your ear on your local machine, or you're in a, like you're alienated from the very physical nature of the technical requirements to make that data happen. And I really fear that the more kind of arbitrary or more like invisibilized or whatever fancy term you want to use about this process happens, it's going to further accelerate not only indigenous land and water dispossession, but again, this kind of notion of endless growth, which I think is super, super dangerous, particularly feeling, climate change and the climate crisis that's happening in the north. And now you're getting some folks that are talking about, oh, we want to put data centers in the north because it's cold. And it's just like, well, if we start colonizing with more and more and more data centers, that again, data centers generate heat with electricity using water. Like that is a fundamental problem that accelerates climate change. So I really do wonder and worry about, especially with so-called generative AI and all these models that just use endless, resources, like it's not a great direction we're going in. So that needs to be talked about more. which is why I went on a little rant there. So thank you.
I love it. This is a space for little rants for data people. So we are coming up on time and we have some really great questions. And at this point, we're also going to bring in Lauren Decker, who is one of my non-federal co-leads on the data management team. Meredith, can we beg for 10, 15 more minutes?
Yep. Yeah.
Thank you. And Jeff, Adrienne, do you have a little bit of time? Beautiful. All right. So I would love to start with this question from Ben Charles of ICC. Ben, do you want to read your question or would you like me to read it for you?
Good to see you, Vanessa. And yes, please, I would love to read it out loud. Beyond everybody for the very insightful dialogue and the different perspective shifts that you have all three of you have revealed to everyone that is present here. Again, thank you, Jeff, and more in particular to both of your responses to Vanessa's topics. In particular, the both of you raising governance and the principles of consent. So my question is then, as our Indigenous knowledge holders, as they are data keepers, data collectors, and data protectors, their Indigenous knowledge, our Indigenous knowledge, how does free and prior informed consent integrate or utilized in governance structures for individual tribes or nations, or a collective of tribes like Inuit in Inuit Nunat, in delineating the access and use where and how such as researchers can access and or use our data? But more importantly, how can governance structures inform us as tribes and nations and as peoples in designing an information data system that reflects our holistic perspectives and encompassing our values around data, Indigenous knowledge? Thank you. Again, thank you very much.
I can try to take a crack at that. My internet again is being wonky. I think we have a large challenge in both the actual infrastructure required to respect consent. A lot of the technologies that we're using were never meant not only to hold collective knowledge, but to do so in a way that requires consent and ongoing consent and consent that can be revoked. So if your infrastructure doesn't have the capacity from a software perspective to do that, that's a huge barrier. So that's the software layer. But then also there is I don't know what to call this, the translation layer to our decision makers that, again, understand how to manage data, but maybe not using the terms that a software developer could understand. And so if someone needs to build a new tool or something like that to make these things work, and those knowledge holders don't have the language that developer is speaking or that politician is speaking, that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I think for me, I just want to zoom in on the prior part of FPIC, prior and informed consent. I think it's those conversations that need to be happening about what is the data going to be used for, what are the agreements, and time needs to be put into those conversations so that tribes or a collective of tribes can make an informed, the I part of that decision around the governance of that data. I'll leave it there.
Adrienne or Lauren, did you have anything you wanted to add here on free, prior, informed consent and governance topics?
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm the other non-federal co-lead for the data management team. And I just wanted to say, I've done a project where I've worked with an Indigenous group in the Hudson Bay. And when we were working for them, and we went through a pretty lengthy process in order to get permission to be able to use data to be able to make a model for them. And that was just sort of our experience in terms of trying to find the pathways of who do you ask to get consent from. And I'm just wondering if our panelists have any thoughts on pathways on who to connect to. We specifically went to the Hunters and Trappers Association for our work.
It's a good question from Lauren, but just to jump in on the prior question, I think the informed consent part is something that physical scientists need to learn more from social scientists about. And I would love to see more like helping ourselves learn and catch up on that side of like when an NSF grant is funded and the NSF people think they're funding a physical science project that's got like, oh, we're going to make this observation. I would love that to be informed by social scientist approaches because we can get ourselves better, that much better first, and then see us level up to this better sovereignty level, data sovereignty level as well altogether. That's my one comment.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of capacity building within the research community as well. Ben, did that address your concerns, your question?
Somewhat. I'll have a follow-up question then from either one of the panelists then. In regards to the limitations of an IDS flowchart or a policy or a protocol that's developed when the infrastructure is being set up, what protocols would you recommend or have experience in developing a system that would allow non-Indigenous people to access? Did you have any agreements set up in place where they, as a user of the data, would create an account and they would go through this process of a EULA and a user agreement, and then also an agreement with the individual nation in how that data would be used and how it would also be beneficial at the end product for the Indigenous peoples that the knowledge is coming from? Those are the types of more specific question than I had revolving around governance structures of IDS systems and infrastructure. And thank you again. I do appreciate it.
I don't know how much of what I last said broke up, or if you can hear me now. Hopefully you can. I turned off as much data things as I could.
Yeah, we hear you.
Perfect. And yeah, I guess, Jeff, you can speak to this a little bit more, but I think one thing that we often do is, like, as we're developing software, we're thinking about different kinds of audiences, like groups of different kinds of users. So like 99% of the work that we're doing, we're respecting Indigenous data, meaning that the holders to those data, like the Indigenous peoples in which those data are related to, they're like the primary audience that we're really ultimately concerned for and with. And so when we're creating the data structures, all the way down to the user roles and their permissions, like at a database level, basically who can see what. So when someone logs into something, what kind of permissions are they granted? And then how are those permissions set up in the data structure so that they have access rights to that particular, whether you want to call it like a unit of data or something like that. While at the same time, respecting that, like you're saying, outsiders, for lack of a better word, may also want some sort of access to those data as well, but maybe on a more restricted level. So that becomes a very challenging data design aspect, where in the actual like database design, you have to really get granular in terms of how, basically, what kinds of roles. So a role being like when somebody logs into the system, what kind of user are they? And then what kind of user they are will determine what kind of permissions they have. And then those permissions will give them access or not into like little subsets, if you will, of the larger data. And so by planning all that out sooner rather than later, like knowing who is going to be dealing with your data, and then how do you plan for that in the actual database design, that's super important to get done early and often. And then making sure that the software that you're using has that core flexibility to do so.
Yeah, so you're asking about what are the protocols in developing systems that allow non-Indigenous people access. So this is where we spend a lot of time when we develop these systems, just talking through all of this and figuring that out. And like Jeff was saying, like, you know, figuring out like the users and roles and like the access list. But I think at a granular level, you know, tables of data, you know, but how do we allow like slivers of data, like you know, subsets of data almost at the attribute level, like the column level in the database for certain roles. And again, the prior part there, like doing all this work beforehand, so everybody knows who's going to have access to which slivers of data, and making sure that the tools that we have can the technical solutions to that, you know, that will enable that. There's other this concept of data trusts that learned a little bit about, a lot of work coming out of the Mozilla Foundation, where they talk about less the technical solutions to permissions and rights and consent, more along the lines of legal frameworks and agreements, and how do you, because sometimes the solution is not a tech solution, sometimes it's just doing that work, it's that relationship building, documenting all of that, and coming to an agreement. And those agreements, you know, that also can change if consent, you know, baking into that agreement when consent can be withdrawn and that kind of thing. There you go. Thanks, Vanessa.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a fangirl of Mozilla as well. I think this is tying into a few other comments that people have put in. Kana, if you're still on the call, would you like to come off mute and share your comment?
Hello, thank you. Sorry, I'm off camera today. I just wanted to make sure to check in about how to, you know, there's lots of ways to protect data, you know, such as a data management plan and various things. But, you know, when it comes to working with universities, as far as what I've experienced with my community partner, is that I needed to make sure that the contracts that we had when it came to granting and things that went through our Office of Sponsored Programs, that those contracts also backed up the data management plan or the way that we worked, we considered intellectual property. And we had to, you know, put in definitions of traditional Indigenous knowledges, because, you know, a lot of the ways that they were trying to define it were in past tense situations versus something that's emerging and evolving over time. And that is, you know, continually generated. So the idea of like how I just wanted to bring up the fact that like make sure to thoroughly read any of contracting going on with regards to grants, anything going through the university system. It's really important because they wind up owning intellectual property by default for a lot of contracts. So that's what I've learned through my institution. So I thought I'd share it aloud.
Thank you, Kana. And if I can also plug your weekly newsletter, you might want to drop that in the data management resources as well, because I think it's very, very relevant. And you've also been doing great webinars with a variety of Arctic research groups. All of the academics on the call, I would behoove us to think carefully about the contracts that we put out in partnership, really with anything to do with our research, but specifically around our data, and to be an advocate in facilitating free, prior, and informed consent around data and any information that's shared. This ties into, I believe it's Riza or Riza, apologies if I misspoke, your question about concepts of data. And if you're still here, if you'd like to read your question, we can discuss it. I'm not seeing them. I'll read it. And they said, do we need to be asking how concepts of data may differ between Western and Indigenous cultures before we talk about data management? Do Indigenous cultures have a different word for what data refers to so that there could at least be a common framework to work with? And Jeff, Doctor, I feel like you talked a little bit about how really there's a sort of endless diversity of concepts and frameworks related to Indigenous concepts of data. I'm not sure if you want to elaborate there or if anyone else has thoughts. Lauren and Adrienne, please do chime in.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to what Kana was talking about, and I really appreciate you bringing that up about the legal question. Like, we're in this such awkward, like the truth of living in a colonial kind of environment, meaning that the colonial laws matter through force. And there's so much treachery involved through contracts, and like the universities have a very long history of this, of basically theft through intellectual property law. And at the same time, does that very law that was never meant for Indigenous data in the way that data has been conceptualized by Indigenous peoples, will that law ever protect us? I don't know. I'm not going to get into that here, but I definitely appreciate that being brought up when it comes to at the contract level. Again, before the project has even started, who, quote, owns the data under the Canadian or American system and whatever colonial system. But then at the end of the day, are there ways to get around that? Because in my personal, not so humble opinion, Indigenous law truly matters. And if Indigenous law truly matters, going back to the sovereignty aspect of things, what happens when that supersedes whatever the hell that contract says? Obviously, there's going to be consequences, but it's something worth noting that the idea of a digital blockade, even when it comes to our knowledges, is also, in my, again, not humble opinion, a potential avenue for protecting data.
Any more thoughts about defining data, how different cultures define data? And if not, we should circle back to Lauren's question as our last question, which was who should we be reaching out to, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, and how should we be soliciting consent? So I'll leave those up as the last two things to discuss today, and to thank everyone for joining us.
I'll say try to be super quick with this one, but this one's super complicated in terms of whose data and who are the rights holders. Well, when we're dealing often with data, especially, we're often dealing with the representatives as like a middle layer to that. And then who are those adequate representatives? And sometimes even in a singular community, you might have conflicting opinions on who ultimately has authority over certain kinds of knowledges. And being able to navigate that is something you have to be aware of, even as a researcher.
I can just add from my perspective that the risk of oversimplifying it, it's the who should we be reaching out to? It's everyone, and doing the due diligence of tracking it down. So as someone who's like on a day-to-day, I'm a data manager, that's my work for the day. Just pushing to like make sure I reach out to everyone as much as possible, and I get to talk to people about who they have reached out to already and ask them more, and I get to sort of just say that I'll make space for this because the funders are funding. The way my work works, the funders are funding me to do data management, and that gives me the opportunity to push and say, I'm going to make as much space as possible here for you to put this in the data management plan, or however you want to translate it, to go and reach out to those folks, because we don't want to take any of that data into our system until we know that we have the setup to do that. Everyone understands that it's happening, and everyone understands what the end product of that looks like. So for me, that's valuable, and I would like to see us make that system even more stronger so that the people who are doing it day to day have the space to do that, to push out and say, let's make space for talk to everyone, which is sort of at risk of oversimplifying. That's not what I mean. So I'm sorry if I'm getting off track. But then I think the other thing I can speak to in the library world is the library world has a lot of work to do on this front. And I'm glad someone linked in the resources local context, which is just the very bare beginning of trying to get a system out there for all of the library digital systems to try to acknowledge and make the space for correcting the way we look at these things and the way we do these things. So whoever put local context into the resource list, thank you very much.
Any parting or closing thoughts from our panelists? Again, deep appreciation for your time. And as someone, Ramy said, for your years of work in these fields and for sharing your experiences.
I guess one thing I'll just say that, you know, just because you're a researcher, that doesn't mean that you're like this neutral entity. Like when you're dealing with Indigenous data, you're dealing with Indigenous people and peoples, both as individuals and collectives. And thus you're getting involved in their business and their lives and their politics, their struggles. And so, you know, words like ally and all that are thrown around a lot. But if you're not political in the sense of understanding how like relationships actually unfold in the real world, and then what's your obligation to those relationships, even as a researcher, you're getting involved. And so you need a sort of sensitivity to that of what is your intervention ultimately going to be, you know, and sometimes not getting involved might be better. And even if you think you're dealing in, you know, some inert territory that nobody has rights to, I guarantee you it's somebody's backyard or somebody's territory. Even if you can't see them or even if you don't know they exist, you're going to be dealing with something Indigenous, particularly in the North. So just always be sensitive to be also consider the politics of the situation as well.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to connect with you all and have these conversations, and for all the resources that have been shared. Thank you so much.
Big thanks from me as well.
Well, Lauren, Meredith, did we do it? We did it? Great. Well, I think we can stop recording now. We are planning as the data management team to have these